Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and a think tank in DC called New America. We're now in our 9th year. We work on research and publications in a variety of areas. We are engaged in teaching, particularly running an online MA in global security. And we also engage in a variety of outreach and events, including this event, which is part of our spring speaker series, and we're really thrilled to have excellent speakers tonight. The talk is called Quiet Opposition, the Political Significance of Russian Migration to Central Asia and the Caucasus Following the 2022 Ukraine Invasion. The event is co-sponsored with our excellent colleagues at the Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, quite relevant for this event. We have two colleagues here, ASU colleagues, who are presenting tonight. We have Margaret Hanson, who's assistant professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies, which is where our center is located. Margaret's an assistant professor. Her research focuses on authoritarian politics and factors that stabilize or conversely undermine dictators and aspiring dictators' control, with an emphasis on the former Soviet Union. More specifically, she's interested in how formal and informal institutions interact to shape governance and autocracies. Her work centers on the role of law, courts, and corruption. She teaches classes in comparative politics, authoritarian politics, political economy, and research methods. We're also joined by Gaukhar Baltabayeva, who's a graduate teaching associate in the School of Politics and Global Studies and a Ph.D. student in our program in political science. Her areas of concentration and interest are comparative politics and international relations, with a focus on international migration and the brain drain. So really briefly, a bit of housekeeping. We'll have the presentation and afterwards time for Q&A. I'll moderate that Q&A, and please just type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We're really thrilled to have our colleagues here presenting tonight, and we'll just pass the floor over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Dan, for the introduction. I will take a brief moment to start sharing my screen here. All right, so this talk is titled Quiet Opposition, and I think the title will be, why we chose this title will be evident as the talk moves on, but it's part of a larger project in which Gaukhar and I are investigating post-invasion Russian migration to Central Asia and the Caucasus and its political implications, as well as its implications for how we understand migration more broadly. So to briefly introduce what sparked this project, I think we're all well aware at this point of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. But what some people are less familiar with is the fact that in the wake of that invasion in February 2022, there were some major waves of Russian out-migration. This occurred in two broad swaths. The first was in the first few months immediately after the invasion, and then the second followed the mobilization order, the partial mobilization order in September. The latter, numerically speaking, was the larger wave, and total estimates for both waves are quite large, from 500,000 to 1 million or more Russians leaving the country. We're going to focus in this talk on migration immediately after the invasion. We do have some ongoing research on the second wave migration, but it's qualitatively different from this first wave. And in terms of speaking about Russian opposition to the war and that general topic, it makes more sense to focus on this first wave. Now, a lot of these Russians who left the country left for destinations like Turkey or Israel or Dubai. But there was a really large number who left to former Soviet states. And here we'll focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. And this is a really unprecedented level of out-migration from a country that's instigating the conflict, but not actually seeing direct conflict on its territory. And so just to give you an idea of what we're speaking about geographically here, our research focuses on 5 different countries where migrants fled from Russia, in the Caucasus, Georgia, and Armenia, and then in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. There were some migrants who went to Tajikistan, but the political environment there, we decided not to conduct research there. And we don't know of anyone who headed to Turkmenistan. It's akin to North Korea in terms of its level of repressiveness. So in conducting this research, we asked 3 basic questions. Our first major question was what factors were driving Russians to emigrate to these two regions in particular. There's reasons for why their choices to go to Central Asia and the Caucasus were a little puzzling in light of what we know about conflict-induced migration in general. And I'll go into that more in a little bit. We're also interested in the impact of the conflict and migration on how these emigres viewed their citizenship and nationality, and what this might imply for the receiving countries and internally for Russia. For the receiving countries, population-wise, these are quite small countries. Even if Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world in territory, as a proportion of these countries' population, this influx of migrants is quite significant, and especially so because they're concentrated in urban areas. So there's a lot of domestic, political, and economic implications. And then for Russia, who is migrating in terms of that population? We'll talk about those implications a little later on. And we also spoke with the migrants to gain some clues about what we could learn about public opinion inside Russia, especially given the fact that any discussion or any criticism of the war has been made illegal, and the repressive environment inside Russia, as we're all aware, is we thought it couldn't get much worse, but it keeps getting worse. So trying to accurately gauge public opinion inside the country sometimes means looking outside of it. So when we're talking about the subject of migration, and in particular migration in response to conflict, the existing scholarly literature really tends to emphasize direct threats to physical integrity. Colloquially, we can think of this as threats to one's person, especially due to exposure to active conflict, or witnessing conflict, or having it be on the country's territory. And of course, this was not the case for Russians who were fleeing the country. We did speak with many politically active Russians in our sample, some of whom had been briefly detained, things like that. But this isn't the sort of direct threat to physical integrity that the literature tends to emphasize. And in terms of factors that pull people to other countries, perceived stability, especially political stability, is widely cited as a factor. But the countries that we study here in Central Asia and the Caucasus have all experienced recent political instability, from the major uprising in January 2022 in Kazakhstan that saw Russia sending CSTO troops to help the government in power there, to protests in Uzbekistan, change of power in Kyrgyzstan, protests in Georgia, Armenia's in a war with Azerbaijan. you get the idea. This is not what we would expect in terms of a pull factor. And another major pull factor is that of economic opportunity, more economic development. And again, these countries are either at a comparable level of economic development with Russia or less developed. And so we don't see, in other words, the kinds of push and pull factors that we would expect to bring people to these countries. I apologize for the dogs barking in the background. I think we're getting a package delivered. And in terms of directionality, generally speaking, we expect migration to go from colonized countries, former colonies, to the sort of former colonial power, and again, from less to more developed. But here we're not really seeing those dynamics. The countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus in particular had a quasi-colonial or outright colonial relationship with Russia during the Soviet Union. And that legacy, while it's only really in many ways starting to be unpacked with the war on Ukraine, generally speaking, the flows have gone the other way, right? There's been a lot of labor migration to Russia, but not in the opposite direction. So the reality, as I started to outline, is that none of the things that we would expect to bring people to these receiving countries are present in the way we would expect. So there's little or no direct experience by most of the migrants with violence in Russia. There's political and economic instability in the receiving countries. They're also not liberal democracies. Some are more illiberal democracies, but they all also retained close relations with Russia, which makes them a little bit of a, in some ways, a puzzling choice if you're fleeing Russia in the wake of this conflict. And there's a question about whether this constitutes reverse brain drain, since most of the migrants tend to be highly educated and skilled. And again, we have this movement from the former colonial center to former colonies that is highly unusual in terms of migration. So we investigated this first wave of migration using in-depth interviews. We collected 47 in total who we recruited through personal networks and encounters, and through also Telegram and Facebook groups oriented towards these relocanti, as they call themselves, or relocated people. Now, tracking down migrants in any context is quite difficult. And even getting a gauge of how many Russians left Russia in the wake of the invasion is really difficult, particularly in these countries because they don't require visas, for example. So we don't have even fine-grained data from the borders. There have been a couple surveys that were conducted, and our profile of the migrants we interviewed closely matches this. So we can surmise that at least the people with whom we're talking are speaking, their experiences resonate with a much larger group. That said, our sample and the ones in these surveys are perhaps for obvious reasons, predominantly opposition-minded. In terms of who's willing to speak with researchers, you're more likely to see those who are in opposition to the regime. So we can't speak to the representativeness of the sample. We do know anecdotally that there were Russians who left, for example, for economic reasons in response to sanctions, but they were not willing to speak with us or any researchers in general. So as you can see from this brief, this brief profile here. This really is a type of brain drain for Russia. The people who are leaving are overwhelmingly young. So the vast majority of people in our sample were under the age of 40. They were 25 to 40 years old. They're highly educated with undergraduate or graduate education at much higher rates than within Russia itself. Middle class and upper middle class. They're very likely to, the majority of them speak English or English and another language. And they're concentrated in the IT sector and arts and media. And this is no accident because most of them are what we now call remote workers. They're able to work digitally. And this has some really interesting implications that we'll discuss a little later on in the talk when it comes to this nexus of political repression and migration. So when trying to understand why people left, as I mentioned, pretty much everyone in this first wave with whom we spoke, which contrasts somewhat with the second wave, were very much regime opponents. But I want to add some nuance to how we understand these political push factors and this idea of opposition throughout the talk. So among the most widely cited factors were fear of domestic repression, infringement on civil liberties, but we also had a large number of people who had been politically active, maybe attended protests, things like that, and after experiences being briefly detained or knowing people who were, there was this feeling, as this quote indicates, that this was a last chance to escape. And indeed, a really interesting thing that we found was that the war was not what sparked people to think about leaving. It rather was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. It was a breaking point. So most of our respondents had been thinking about leaving for some time, generally going back to some key points in recent Russian history. For example, the election fraud and protests in 2011, or the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014. And for many, there was this fear of mobilization, or that the borders were going to close, a sense that they didn't trust the regime, they didn't know what was going to happen, and so they had to get out while they could. And these political factors were really front and center in why people left, but economic factors were closely intertwined as well. Several respondents noted economic decline inside Russia, saying, yeah, we have oil and gas, but in general, everything's been getting worse, and there's no way it's going to improve now that the war has happened. And sanctions just further compounded this, where they saw their business connections abroad, or their salaries kind of evaporate. But a really interesting and unexpected finding was taxation, actually. Many respondents saw the idea of paying taxes to Russia as morally repugnant, because politically it was going to support this war that they opposed. And so for them, an act of resistance was to actually leave Russia and to stop paying into government coffers to help finance this war. On the flip side, there were many people who also still kept their jobs inside Russia, and so were continuing to work remotely for, let's say, a Russian company while outside the country. In terms of other push factors, personal and psychological factors played a role, in particular aspirations to study and live abroad or to develop business connections abroad. But there was also a sense that by removing themselves from Russia, they could distance themselves from the war, from the conflict. So even though they were not directly experiencing, let's say, violence related to the war, keep in mind this is before the mass mobilization. So the only people coming home in bags at that point were still people who had signed up to serve in the military for the most part. But there was this sense of instability and anxiety and not knowing what was going to happen, and also discussed with people around them, and support for the war in Russian society, which I'll talk about a little later. And so exit was a way of actually voicing their opposition to all of this and distancing themselves from it. So in terms of pull factors, this explains a lot of why people did end up in some of these countries. This ranges from the obvious in terms of the fact that sanctions had closed off many avenues for people to, in terms of where people could go from Russia, whereas in Central Asia and the Caucasus, there are no visa or international passport requirements. And indeed, some places like Uzbekistan, for example, introduced a special visa to try and attract tech talent that enabled people to work in the country. And the countries also, most of the migrants were initially coming from major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and moving to Central Asia, cities in Central Asia and the Caucasus, meant that they could enjoy a high standard of living because costs were relatively low. And due to dense ties in terms of business and trade and social networks with these countries that were in large part due to the shared Soviet legacy, many people were able to, for example, find work in these new countries through their professional networks. And this shared Soviet past, I spoke earlier in the talk about this movement from a former colonizer to colonies. That is not something that has necessarily really, while it's a very big topic of discussion, not only in the West, but also in places like Central Asia, the Caucasus, and obviously Ukraine and the Baltics. In Russia itself, this discussion has not really percolated to the same extent. And instead, there's this perceived cultural closeness without a sense of why that some of the violence behind that closeness. So people saw the cultures as similar. They could transition more easily because a lot of people still spoke Russian. So in this case, these ties actually helped make these countries a softer landing pad for migrants. Indeed, there were a few who tried to migrate elsewhere and said it was too different. We needed to go closer to home. There were also networks of emigre friends. So most people, interestingly enough, didn't rely on, let's say, familial networks or things like that in terms of determining where to migrate. But once some people migrated, let's say, to Georgia, others, their friends followed. And this was particularly true, for example, in IT, where people might be very closely connected, and they sort of followed their friends where they migrated. So one thing I want to highlight here, and a really interesting and new implication of not only for Russia, but also more broadly, is this connection between remote work and repression. So if you think back to the profiles of the migrants that we interviewed, those pie charts I showed earlier, the vast majority were in either the IT sector or arts and media. And so these were people who predominantly were able to work remotely. They could pick up and move without having to necessarily change careers or even jobs most of the time. And this raises some really key questions about current and future migration and other issues, because in many ways, these highly educated young people in these kinds of fields are exactly who have often in the past led opposition movements in autocracies, or who we would expect to be sort of the backbone of any opposition to the regime and to the war that did occur. But instead, we have hundreds of thousands of them leaving. And so I think it's a question worth considering whether actually allowing many of these people to leave is something that benefits Russia by reducing the amount of repression it even needs to engage in. We know that with respect to things like protest movements, for example, they tend to have what are called tipping dynamics. So you need sort of a triggering event and often a hardcore of really dedicated activists to get things rolling before it starts snowballing and things start catching on. But these are exactly the people who've been leaving. And we're also seeing, whereas when the Soviet Union fell, many highly educated people left the countries where we conducted these interviews to go to Russia, Germany, and elsewhere. Now we're seeing a sort of reversal of that with potentially interesting implications for economic development in these countries, but also with the nexus of remote work more broadly, right? Now that you could keep your white collar job and perhaps live in a country like Kyrgyzstan, this has big implications for how we would see the dynamics of migration change, especially in response to repression. Whereas before that repression that in things like crackdowns on civil liberties, your ability to get information or speak freely or protest might not have been enough for you to give up your job and pack up your life and move. Having the ability to continue to work for these middle and upper class people lowers the cost of migration and can be actually facilitates it in response to repression. And then there's the question of how this influx of largely pro-democracy, anti-Russian migrants can reshape politics in receiving countries, both in response to, in terms of supporting those sorts of causes or movements in the receiving countries, which, as I noted, are not liberal democracies themselves, and in terms of how people there have reacted to them. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. In terms of the war and identity, there were three broad views regarding how the migrants with whom we spoke discussed what it meant to be Russian in the context of the war and migration. The largest proportion either wanted to disassociate themselves completely from Russia. Often this meant if they were not ethnically Russian or were ethnically mixed, highlighting those other identities, which suggests similar processes could possibly unfurl inside Russia, given the opportunity. Many had a sense of conflicted belonging. They recognized, well, I'm Russian, that's the culture I grew up with, et cetera, but we're starting to wrestle with why Russian society widely supported the war, for example, and their linkages in that respect. And the last group saw themselves as not responsible in any way for the state in Russia. So there was no sense, they said the state is separate. We didn't vote for Putin. It's a corrupt regime. We have no sort of agency or responsibility. And so you can't, there was also among this group a lot of resentment, for example, against sanctions and anti-Russian sentiment, because it said, well, essentially, we didn't do this. Why are you blaming us? This is just the regime. But a really unifying sentiment among all three groups, keeping in mind none of them were really in favor of the war at all. They were opposed to the war and to Putin. they expressed hopelessness about the prospects for at least immediate change in Russia. As I noted, many of them had attended protests or had been politically active. The vast majority of our respondents had a high degree of interest in politics, but it just seemed impossible against the vast machinery of the state and overall public sentiment and support for the war to do anything about it. So they saw their only option in terms of resistance, if they didn't want to spend decades in jail, was to leave and to express themselves in that manner. And several of them also really decried what they described as a Russian cultural tendency to be to endure endlessly, as the quote at the bottom here notes, that people would essentially put up with almost anything, and so they couldn't do it any longer, and their only option was to leave. And so, as I've alluded to, as we start to wrap up here, migrants, one thing that they consistently noted was that there was widespread support for the war inside Russia. And this is a really interesting question because, of course, in the current environment of repression, it's very difficult to, for example, trust surveys because it's very dangerous to answer honestly to many of the questions that we would like to know the answers to. But the emigres tended to note that the widespread support for the war that they were so frustrated with, this polarization in Russian society among those who are for and against the war, that it was polarization, that there were differences along generational and geographical lines, which does comport with what we know, for example, from surveys by the Levada Center, which is one of the few survey firms still operating inside Russia. As a few people noted, younger people did tend to be much more against the war, but older people much more in favor. And indeed, some migrants had a falling out with their parents, with their grandparents, and had tried to convince them that the news they were seeing on TV, the government propaganda, was false, and essentially met with a wall and saw no choice but to sever ties and to leave. And of course, in the regions, access to information through things like VPN, exposure to outside sources of information on ideas was much more limited. So there was a big geographical difference, for example, in between how migrants described folks living in Moscow or St. Petersburg and those who were more distantly flung. But another major trend was that they all really noted this role of government propaganda and information and misinformation in building this support for the war. So to wrap up, what we found among these first wave migrants is that they were predominantly driven by political motivations, and for the vast majority of them, emigration was a way to vote with their feet. They saw absolutely no hope for change within Russia, at least in the short to medium term, and so for their own consciences, they needed to leave. And an interesting sort of intersection is the way that law in these receiving countries and historical legacies and ties to Russia, coupled with the restrictions imposed by sanctions that limited movement to many other places, in conjunction further with this advent of remote work, made it possible for a lot of this quiet or soft opposition. So these aren't major opposition figures. These are ordinary people, maybe students who went to a protest or two. But because the cost of leaving was lower and the cost of staying was so much higher, and they were able to find sort of a soft landing pad in some of these former Soviet republics. Now, I think a question that probably interests a lot of people is, what does this mean for things inside Russia, for Russia's future? And again, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But one thing we know from literature on how protests movements get moving, so if we're interested, right, in the possibility of resistance from below, not from among elites, is that expectations really matter. If you expect hundreds of thousands of other people to go out onto the streets, if that momentum gets going, and then you have the expectation that everyone else feels the same way that you do, you're much more likely to act on your feelings of opposition than if, for example, you think that everyone, as most of our respondents thought the majority of people in Russia did, that the war was something that they should support and that they should support Putin's regime. So these expectations, in conjunction with the high level of repression that's really raised costs for speaking out inside Russia, means that prospects for any sort of mass protests or uprising, barring something unexpected, which is always a possibility with these sorts of things, or change in conditions, is not something I have an optimistic prognosis for. And finally, the interview suggests that support for the war is widespread, but that the information environment is really key in maintaining that support. And I will stop sharing and leave it at that. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. It's full of very rich data, and it would be interesting to hear. You mentioned there's certain aspects of legal regimes and other elements of the relationship, of the ability of Russians to leave their country and settle in a variety of other places. Could you go into a little bit more specificity as to why these particular individuals end up in the countries they do, and how they might differ from the many Russians who've gone to other countries sort of not covered by your study? And maybe one final thing, do you have any sense of how the percentages of Russians who've fled the country, play out between these countries and other countries around the world?
Sure. Gaukhar, do you want to start with this one? Or?
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. And I think that the choice for the region that we study was naturally selected because since Russia invaded Ukraine, they experienced another wave of sanctions, which actually restricted the where Russians could go. So they couldn't go to Europe, which was very popular destination for Russian migrants, Russian tourists, or they could not go to any other countries that tightened their visa regimes. So they perhaps didn't think before the sanctions and invasion of going to countries like Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan. Some said that they never heard a lot about these countries. They didn't know the culture or the climate, but when they look up for available flights, they just decided to leave the country wherever they could go. So I think sanctions explain a lot when it comes to why migrants ended up where they are currently. And another very important thing is that Central Asian countries and the Caucasus, they have very relaxed visa regimes for Russian citizens. For example, they don't need visas, and in some cases, they don't even need international passport. For example, Russian citizen can cross the border of Kazakhstan with their national ID, and that would be perfectly fine. They could stay there for 90 days and then prolong their stay. Since then, since the invasion and since the mobilization order, some countries, they actually revised their immigration policies, but nevertheless, these are very open destinations for those who would like to leave Russia currently, or as they did in last year. Yeah.
And I would add on to that, one thing I didn't mention in the presentation is that some people were only planning to stay temporarily until they could get visas and move elsewhere, but then others were planning to stay. And many of those who were planning to stay were those who'd been able to, for example, find work, or they talked about cultural closeness, or the fact that many of their friends and colleagues were also in, say, Georgia or Kazakhstan. So it was a combination of, I think, these legal factors initially, which were in large part the pull factors, the lack of visas, et cetera, is really a legacy of of both the Soviet era and the continued close relations that Russia has had with these countries, which is something that's changing dynamically as we speak.
Two questions related to your research from participants. From Olzas Zoryev, what is the source of migrants' background data? I assume that means the data that you're presenting in this research. And then related, just because they're both part of your research, is a question from Mason. Is there a way that you could talk about the source or sources of your push-pull directionality paradigm? So two aspects of the particular elements of the research you presented.
Sure. So in terms of the source of the migrants' background data, we asked them. It was part of the interview questionnaire. But as I mentioned, there have been some surveys. There were 2 surveys. One of them you can find on the PONARS, which is a consortium of academics working on the region. They wrote a memo where they noted some recent survey results. I know there's people, so their data broadly reflects what we found in terms of the people we interviewed. With respect to the paradigm, that's our, I mean, Gaukhar, if you want to add on to this, but it's broadly how we distilled a pretty vast literature. It's not a paradigm we're taking from any.
Yeah, when we were analyzing the data, so we have like 5 countries, we have Russian citizens fleeing the country, but it's unprecedented wave of migration. So one way we started thinking about this wave is just like seeing whatever this case fits theoretically, and what we found that neither like conflict-induced migration literature or brain drain literature reflected the same dynamics as we found in our case. One way to present the case for us was to show how our case is different from what is widely studied in the literature. So this is how we came up with the push and pull and directionality paradigm here.
Question here from our colleague Gary Grossman. Ethnic Russians in former states of the Soviet Union have long been thought to be threats to political stability, as in Moldova. I would like to know more about your thoughts about the political impact of recent Russian influx in Central Asia.
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question. This is the direction that we're kind of going with next in the research. So the sheer size of the influx has already had some political impacts in terms of, for example, Kazakhstan has reduced the window that Russians can stay there. But we have seen most of the populations in these countries are predominantly, for obvious reasons, anti-war. And even among the first wave migrants who were opposed to the war, there's another question on that front that I'll address in a second. There's potentially a lot of animosity there, and this is heterogeneous across countries. So I think the mood on the ground in Georgia tends to be much more testy with respect to this influx. And in Kazakhstan, you had people setting up welcome centers, for example, in some areas. What this means long term, part of it will really depend on how many of these people end up staying, because I know a lot of them are using this as sort of a temporary stopping point. And for those who do decide to stay long term, whether or not they attempt to sort of integrate into local culture and society, learn languages, things like that, or whether they don't, I guess. But also in terms of for those who are pro democracy, anti-Putin, in places like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, if they continue to be politically active, that has potentially interesting implications for things like the development of civil society, protests, things like that. Although I wouldn't see those changes as being something short-term destabilizing. I think that would be sort of a slow burn if it does occur. What we're more likely to see is, among the people who we weren't able to interview, those who might be there out of convenience for economic reasons, but still favor the regime. If that creates conflict with local societies, or some of the economic impacts of this influx of migrants have been in many ways detrimental to things like the ability to find an apartment. You have cases of students getting kicked out of their apartments to make room for Russians who will pay higher rent, things like that. That could really lead to a pushback against migrants, on top of already a big spike in anti-Russian sentiment in most of these places. So it does have the potential to, I think, be destabilizing. And we're starting to see this in terms of how some, at least, of these governments engage with Russia and how they're distancing themselves from it.
A related question here from Keti Sostishnavili. It seems to me that migrants that you've interviewed are predominantly against the war, something you mentioned, and the political regime. But from my experience, there are many migrants that left Russia just for their personal comfort, but they still support the political regime in Russia and even the war. For example, in Tbilisi, after the first wave of migration, there have been many conflicts occurring in the cafes and some other public spaces on political grounds. Have you had any response that resonates with this? In Georgia, we don't really see migrants who are active in expressing their protest against the Russian government or the war.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I'm glad that you brought it up. It's some of this obviously is selection bias. So those who are for the war weren't really interested in talking to people from an American university. We did try to recruit people who were more pro-war or neutral, but again, they simply didn't want to talk with us. Now, that said, even figuring out who a migrant is in a place like Tbilisi is difficult, because tourism, Georgia, for example, is a major tourist destination. And so, distinguishing who's a migrant versus who's there for a week-long vacation is difficult. And So I think, so in terms of getting at this phenomenon, it's difficult because of the amount of back and forth that is still happening in terms of population flows. I do think like there were a lot of people who were politically active who left for places like Georgia, but we termed the talk quiet opposition exactly because these people, most of them were not hardcore activists. And their interest in many ways was not contributing to the conflict by paying taxes or fighting, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were going to be willing to be hardcore activists once they got out of the country.
A question here. What are some of the repercussions of this wave of migration for local societies, culturally and economically? Do you anticipate that the presence of potentially radioactive, in quotations, Russian immigrants may tighten security and surveillance for people who come into touch with them within authoritarian-led countries?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Like, it speaks to the political context that we are dealing with in Central Asia, and in particular, what is peculiar with this wave of migrants, it's again that there are a lot of remote workers. Those remote workers that we interviewed, they actually said that they interact with local societies minimally because they have to stay at their apartments, work for their companies. They do two shifts sometimes, so there is no way for them to interact with local population a lot. But still, we can anticipate that they could have impact on receiving societies, especially in the case of Uzbekistan, who was like welcoming all the IT specialists and introducing new visa type for IT workers. So here we see that there is skill demand in this region, and this is something that we will be interested in studying in the future. Studying both local responses and studying long-term effects of this wave and the second wave of migrants after the mobilization order in resilient societies. Yeah.
Two questions picking up very much on what you just said from Alex Abernathy and Sarah Mastoff. First, Alex's question: considering the careers are majority IT related, couldn't those countries who accepted them and allowed them to work see this as a temporary boost to the economy, assuming there's a skill demand? And a related question here from Sarah Mastov: within the context of many of these migrants being white collar, how will the influx affect the budding growth of middle class in these countries? And does this affect the job market locally? So two related questions quite linked to your comments just now.
Exactly. And just to give a little bit of what we're doing currently and our future plans with this project, we're studying second wave migration, those people who chose to migrate after compulsory mobilization order in September. So that wave is very different from the first wave we talked about here in terms of their demographics, in terms of their motivations, in terms of their potential impact on the receiving society. So this is something that we should keep in mind. I spotted there was a question where the data on migrant profiles come from. So this was a description of our sample in the first wave. But our second wave sample looks a little bit differently. There are more younger people, less educated, they occupied in different sectors, and they express very clear motivation of evading the draft. They are not necessarily regime opponents. So one of the aims of our future work is to compare both ways and then move forward with local responses.
And to build on the question about, whether this is potentially a boost to the economy or how this affects the local job market. So some places, like, for example, Uzbekistan has actively tried to recruit IT migrants. In other places like Kazakhstan, for example, a lot of the respondents were able to find work locally, or there have been Russian companies that have essentially relocated their staff to, for example, Kazakhstan, and told them they had to move there. So Kazakhstan has also actively tried to poach many of these businesses from Russia and try to get them to relocate in Kazakhstan. In Georgia and Armenia, they also have quite well developed tech centers, but many of these people are just, again, continuing to work remotely. So that opens the question of, to what extent are they really contributing, and this is a question for future research, to what extent are they really contributing to the local economy if their work is based elsewhere and their local contributions are really confined to, for example, renting an apartment and buying groceries and entertainment. And I think that's an open question in terms of what sort of broader economic impacts that's going to have.
So migration is a pressing issue around the world. We're seeing larger numbers of migrants globally, particularly those fleeing a variety of situations, whether war or other kinds of dangerous, difficult circumstances. What is specific about this migratory pattern, and what can we learn more generally in relationship to understanding migration and understanding the role of migrants in various responses to difficult situations, autocratic regimes, whether in the country they fled or in the country they've moved to, and just the larger movement of people and its political meaning for our world?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. I think it's where we're going next with the research. In that, what I think we're seeing with this conflict is not only this the culmination of increased repression and belligerence on the part of Russia, but it's colliding with major technological changes that have changed the nature of labor. And so that means that perhaps let's say you were a political opponent of the regime, but and now you can keep your job if you leave, or you can be guaranteed a source of income and employment, which reduces a lot of the uncertainty and lowers the costs of leaving Russia, right? Or any other authoritarian regime. Whereas previously, if you were thinking about leaving, that also meant you would have to find all new employment, and there was no guarantee you'd be able to do so, or that you'd be able to do so at a comparable income level or a similar field. So the costs to leaving are suddenly much lower. And it becomes, I think, a much more attractive way to express your dissatisfaction with the regime, and potentially in many ways gives those who would be most likely to lead resistance to political repression, to autocratic rule, gives them they're more likely to leave and less likely to head those kinds of movements against the regime. So in some ways it could potentially strengthen autocrats.
We're nearing sort of the end of the presentation here. I just want to cover a couple of the questions that are here in the queue, and then just give you a chance to have some final thoughts. So one question here from Justin Zyla is, are the characteristics of this immigration, this migratory pattern, to what degree are they uncommon as compared to the literature? Similarly, to what degree is the brain drain that you talk about, is that significant for this wave of migration? Mm-hmm. And then finally, related point, to what degree can you tell that the first or second waves are very much in response to changes in Russian military conscription? Mm-hmm. And any final thoughts? I realize that's a lot, but we are here towards the end of the talk.
Yeah, so yeah, I can start answering some questions, and then I think Dr. Hanson can join. I think one thing that we should keep in mind is that migration like is a very historical thing. There has been a lot of like international global ways of migration, and migration from Russia is not a new phenomenon. So a lot of highly educated, skilled Russians, they left Russia once the Soviet Union collapsed for Western European countries, for the United States, Canada, Australia, and this wave of migration also reflects this outflow of very skilled, educated migrants, what we call brain drain here. But what is unique in this case that they are not going to the West, they're not going to more developed places, they go to those places that are welcoming them at the current moment, and this in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Another thing is why this wave of migration is unique is that we don't see very violent conflict on the territory of Russia. So those who leave, they can be politically motivated, but still cost of migration very important in their considerations too. So they look like economic migrants who want to minimize their risk, avoid the threats, financial threats to physical security, and go to places where they could afford like living, and especially with housing being affordable in Central Asia, this is a nice place for them to go. Historically, we could compare draft evasion to the case when American citizens were migrated to Canada during the Vietnam War, but they were more ideologically motivated migrants. In our sample, we found that a lot of them are liberally minded, but we would like to study that further, whether those who evaded the mobilization were doing that for ideological reasons as well. So yeah, it's like these waves of migrations, they both reflect some historical patterns, but not in a sense that we used to talk about them in a way that literature talks about them. So that's why this wave is quite unique. Yeah.
And Margaret, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think in terms of what makes this wave unique as well is really the international context, and the sense that if you are liberally minded, not only have sanctions impacted, suddenly shrank the world, and perhaps kind of made it feel like the walls are closing in a little bit, but this sense that if you are a liberally minded Russian, if you stay in Russia, you are associated much more clearly with what the regime is doing, and this idea that what the part of the world that you identify with is thus against you. So this exit as voice, I think, is a phenomenon that's related both to this advent of remote work that makes it less costly to leave, but also can't be separated from the international context and how the war is viewed in that sense.
So thank you so much for this excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Margaret Hanson and Gaukhar Baltabayeva. We learned a lot tonight. Thank you all for joining us, those out there in the audience. We have 2 more events in our Spring Speaker Series. April 20th, we'll have Nadia Abu El-Haj from Columbia University presenting on her book, Combat Trauma, Imaginaries of War and Citizenship in Post-9/11 America. And then to end our Spring Speaker Series, April 27th, our good colleague, George Post, speaking about what we've learned from COVID-19 and whether we're prepared for the next pandemic. So thank you, everybody. We wish you all a wonderful evening and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.